Now, if I could introduce Emma Greenland from Anderson Acoustics. Emma is advisor to the DFE Department for Education, SEN, more specific acoustics, but more specifically SEN and inclusion. And Emma's going to talk to us now about acoustic design for SEN students and inclusive learning environments in mainstream schools. Yep, thank you.
Great, thank you, Colin. Thank you for the invite to Ecofon today. Thank you all for staying in what is the last session, and perhaps you weren't aware that there's a spa on site at the hotel. Hope I'm not going to lose my audience by sharing that secret. So yeah, this is what I'm talking about today. A bit of background on me and why I've kindly been invited today. I did my PhD in classroom acoustics with Bridget Shield in London. And yes, I was one of the co-authors of the regulatory document in England, which is called Building Bulletin 93. That was one of the first places where school acoustics got regulated, to my knowledge, rather than it being a guidance document. I was also one of 4 subject matter experts for a research project funded by our Department for Education last year. And that's along with Jack Harvey-Clark, who's also in the audience, Adrian James, and Bridget Shield also. I'm also at the sharp end of schools and SEND issues. As a governor, I have a SEND role in my local primary school, and I was also involved in an early years setting in a preschool. And I'm an advocate for equal access to listening. And the challenge I wanted to deal with in this latest piece of research is how we might reasonably adjust acoustics to ensure that the design of the classroom doesn't place people with disabilities at a disadvantage. And we published in 2019, Anderson Acoustics, after doing a couple of conference papers on this, a white paper, which you're welcome to have a copy of. Couldn't fit many in my hand luggage on the flight over here, but you can download it from our website. And last year's research is building on that very much. And the whole idea was of seeing what the acoustic design could do and what was capable of doing in a mainstream setting, but also not shouldering the complete burden on the acoustic design, looking at the role that other factors might be able to play as well, as you can see there. For the non-acousticians in the room, what we're talking about is plenty of issues, acoustic issues when looking at school design, sound insulation, etc. But what we're looking at is lost that, but down in the right-hand corner there, the combination of reverberation time and noise ingress or system noise, ambient noise in the classroom, contributing to speech intelligibility. Another slide for the non-acousticians in the room, a visual analogy showing what those 2 factors do to the speech signal, reverberation time tending to blur that signal, and high ambient masking noise acting to mask that speech signal and reducing the so-called signal-to-noise ratio. So what the UK's Building Bulletin 93 standard, the document says, is in order to fulfil their duties under the Equality Act, school client bodies need to anticipate the needs of deaf and other disabled children as current and potential future users of the school. So we're no longer with that having these kind of conversations where you talk to your client and your client just says, oh, there aren't any deaf children in our school. You know, don't have to consider it. It's, we certainly do have to. There's another document which all Department for Education procured schools have to, is the specification document, the output specification. So they say that people with disabilities must not be placed at a disadvantage by the design of the building, and that includes the acoustic design. So what we need to ask ourselves is, who are these people with disabilities that might be disadvantaged? How many are there in our mainstream classrooms? And how might we quantify that disadvantage? Because if you want to get the Department for Education to listen, you need to start speaking their lingo. So we can answer who in the Building Bulletin 93 document. There's that list of those with special hearing and communication needs, who you're probably all very aware. I won't rattle through the list, you can see it there. In addition, under the Equality Act, though, we do have these protected groups, and that includes age, age discrimination, and it includes English as an additional language, but they're no means special educational needs, so they're considered a non-SEN, but something we need to consider. And then since that Building Bulletin 93 document was published in 2015, We also need to start thinking about a new but emerging and significant need called social, emotional and mental health needs, dyslexia, and other language impairments, which I'm going to call DLD, and specific language impairment. I apologise in advance, there's a lot of three-letter acronyms, so if English isn't your first language, trust me, the English people find it hard to keep up as well. Okay, so to answer how many, so back in 2019, we did this study on the Department for Education's own school statistics collected every year. And out of 8 million children learning in 20,000 mainstream schools in England and Wales, 6% on average was the answer for capturing those children with those special hearing and communication needs. Updated that last year, actually with the 2021 information. We've probably got 2022 available now. And you can see that 6% has grown, zooming into the actual mainstream sector there. That's grown from 6 to 8% now. And then social emotional, that new SEMH need, is 3% as well. What other observations do we have about that? SEMH is increasing with age as we go up from nursery through to primary, through to secondary school. Specific learning difficulty increases with age, and speech, language, and communication needs decreases with age, with it being most prevalent in the nursery and early years sector. Autistic spectrum disorder and hearing impairment and visual impairment remain fairly consistent. I've also dropped in mild and temporary hearing impairment, so that blue bar there could shift up and down because of comorbidities, as I think Marco was covering in his paper earlier in the day. But you can see it's suddenly a significant number of children in any mainstream classroom, so every mainstream classroom needs to think about having a significant number of children with these needs. I'll break off to talk a little bit about early years, because the evidence base there is demonstrating a crucial need for good acoustics in early years settings. But we've got daycare facilities, they've got the highest measured noise levels, 70 and up to 85 dBA to have to cope with in these settings. Young children have got a speech perception deficit in noise, and even 3-year-olds are differently affected to 4- and 5-year-olds, and obviously massive difference between them and adult or secondary age learners. Lower noise in daycare, when you acoustically treat the building, that's been linked to all sorts of improved listening skills and well-being in children. Speech, language and communication needs is the most prevalent identified need, and it's also the highest prevalence of English as an additional language in that sector. Young children lack the phonological awareness and auditory processing, sentence recall, and just the discipline to focus on a task. So they're at double jeopardy here. And also mild and temporary hearing loss is highly prevalent at that age group. And yet, in the UK, acoustic standards remain pretty much completely unregulated in early years settings in England. Touching quickly on the attainment impact, we've got a lot of research in the data all about hearing impairment and how we design for hearing impaired children. But if you look at those progress scores there, it's not hearing impairment who have that greatest need. You've actually got a 30% gap for speech and communication needs, 25% for those with ASD, and far less research, sadly, in those two areas. Jumping back to acoustic performance standards, I know you'll probably all be familiar with this, or a version of this that you deal with regulation in your countries, unless you're in South Africa, of course. But I'm sure you will have used similar parameters for design. So we can see that in secondary schools, you start off with a bit of a higher reverberation time, acknowledging when you are working with younger years, you've got a shorter reverberation time limit because of their deficit in poor acoustics. And then when we've got so-called rooms designed specifically for speech, hearing, communication needs, and that's got very much a lower ambient noise criterion, and it's got an even shorter reverberation time, coupled with a control at low frequency too. So we might ask, if inclusion is such an important issue, can't we just apply that enhanced standard to all mainstream classrooms? That would be really nice. And it was a problem that we started The discussion kept going round, and that's what inspired me to do this research in the first place, really, because there are constraints, and it's sometimes difficult to achieve that standard in mainstream classrooms. Here's a few hints and pointers. So firstly, in that top corner there, we've got thermal cooling strategy. In UK, we have a lot of concrete soffit buildings, and so we use suspended absorbers on the ceiling. They don't absorb bass frequencies terribly well. They definitely have their place, but you can make up for that with thick wall panels. But there is rarely room left sometimes with the number of wall panels you need to achieve that really short reverberation time. In a quest for things like daylighting and providing airy spaces in cross vents, sometimes the actual room height can increase quite a bit. Every time you increase the height of the room above 3.2 meters, it means that more wall sound absorption is going to be needed. Then you've got the sheer group size in mainstream schools. You're not teaching in small groups. You've got 30 children, at least sometimes in these rooms, and they're generating their own noise. So designing right down to 30 decibels doesn't make so much sense when you know how much noise the children generate just when they're quiet. They only have to be breathing, and they're up at about 40 dBA from the research. Large rooms also need some reverberation to support the teacher's voice, and we've heard a few papers on that already today. And in our quest for natural ventilation, that's got to be right up there in the priority list, or at least hybrid ventilation. We don't want to be mechanically ventilating these rooms where at all possible, and that's going to need to have a bit of compromise to increase the noise level. So how do we quantify the disadvantage? This is the study. It's not new research that I've done, it's review work that I have done, building on the research that's already out there and just changing the language of that. So a lot of those researchers are in the room, so thank you for your work. So firstly, we looked at the listening gap, looking at the difference in speech perception scores for the impaired group and the non-impaired group, and that revealed when you're looking at ideal acoustic conditions, it's silent, it's anechoic, you're going to have an inherent listening gap which is associated with that particular need. Then when you start to vary the acoustic conditions, things are probably going to get worse for those groups, and that's what I've called the acoustic listening gap, the so-called disadvantage. So we looked at, in 2019 for the white paper, various different needs: minimal hearing loss, mild and moderate hearing loss, severe to profound, English as an additional language, and age. And you can see for some of those needs, there's several studies there. And what was interesting about that, well, before I go on to say that, I'll say that last year, for the DFE project, we updated that evidence base for various other needs, expanded the needs, and we also looked at what was happening, not just in the quiet classroom when children are quiet, focused, listening to their teacher, but looked at the active room, where we've got some children's babble to deal with as well. So that was the evidence base. So the results from 2019 then, you can see that on the inherent listening gap column there, the children with significant hearing loss are certainly the most disadvantaged. But what's interesting, you look at severe to profound hearing loss, there were several studies in that, and I'm surprised that it's only 9 to 12% that's quite consistent amongst several studies which had different experimental setups in their experiments. For milder needs, though, like age, like English as additional language, like mild hearing loss, the inherent gap is smaller. And that when we're around 1 to 4%, actually the variation within that group is comparable. So statistically, it's less significant. However, in non-ideal conditions, not shown here, but the disadvantage quickly grows in quiet, and that can become as large as 40% for hearing impairment, even when you've got a compliant classroom in terms of the building bulletin performance standards. For milder needs, the disadvantage in quiet can still double in those compliant classrooms. And then we've derived the ideal acoustic conditions, and you can see, we've got age groups needing up to 15 dB if you've got no other educational need. Some of the milder needs, I say milder needs, I mean, it's still a need we need to consider, but you're within the 15 dB signal to noise ratio there. Whereas if you've got more significant hearing loss, you want to be up and achieving well over 15 dB and up to sort of 20 dB, and really control that reverberation time. That doesn't change. Those are the ideal conditions for the acoustic design of the room. But how can we look at other aspects and look at the role that listening aids play? And that's detailed in that last column. This is the results from the 2022 study. You can see we've increased the number of needs that we've looked at and increased the evidence base there. So we've got, and we've also got in the disadvantage in the active classroom, and that's where I've taken the results for 0 dB signal to noise ratio. So for the non-acousticians in the room, that's where the speech level is going to be equivalent to the noise level there. So we can see that that disadvantage massively increases as soon as you're dealing in a babbly classroom for those most severe hearing loss needs. Then we've also got a disadvantage in active classrooms for auditory processing disorder, for autistic spectrum disorder, a significant one for ADHD as well in particular. And I was surprised about the research I didn't know about before, which was dyslexia, that these children with dyslexia can listen without a disadvantage in a quiet classroom. As soon as you put them into that active noise scenario, this disadvantage shows up there. You've got to be a bit careful with those results because dyslexia is always a bit comorbid with other needs too, but certainly there's some research there on developmental language delay and specific language impairment too. And indeed, English as an additional language, cope okay in a quiet classroom. As soon as you bring in that babbly active noise scenario, they're disadvantaged again in the active class. So how can we reduce that disadvantage? Well, that's where the reasonable adjustment comes in, because we still want to make sure that we're supporting the teacher's voice. So we're talking about a reverberation time to 0.5 seconds, and that can accommodate the milder needs with a combination of 35 decibels to make sure we're maintaining our signal-to-noise ratio. Then we're talking about using listening aids to boost that signal, and they also are quite good at cancelling noise as well, and to get that virtual reduction in reverberation time. And there's all sorts of classroom management strategies, which I won't go into, but certainly using quiet rooms, quiet zones, quiet pods within the classroom, also really useful. Probably not got time to go into this slide, but this is what Bridget Shield contributed to in the DFE study. She used the secondary school study that she'd carried out back in 2015, and she did some new regression analysis. And what she found that when you've got those active classrooms of 20 or more children, to keep those occupied noise levels below those known to affect the performance of pupils, the IANL, the indoor ambient noise level, shouldn't exceed 35, and the reverberation time shouldn't exceed 0.5 seconds. So that was just some extra evidence for that reasonably adjusted condition. Listening aids, who can benefit? So even when you've achieved your signal-to-noise ratio of 15 decibels, the listening gap for severe to profound hearing loss increases from that 12% right up to 40%, even in a quiet classroom. But that personal listening device, as I said, will remove the reverberation from the speech signal. And then it's effectively achieving those ideal conditions, the boost to 20 dB signal-to-noise. This is the results of the review of the impact of personal listening aids. Gary Rance, an audiologist in Australia, has done some really great work, and others, looking at how you can eradicate that. If you look at the severe to profound results there, where you're at 46 to 66% in an active classroom, you put on a personal listening aid, and that average disadvantage dials right back to 14%, almost back to the inherent gap, which we can't really do anything about because that's sort of the inherent need. Loads of other really positive stuff going on with autistic spectrum disorder, practically eradicated that disadvantage with a personal listening aid on. Auditory processing disorder as well, back to almost zero difference in terms of signal to noise needed. Not so clear on ADHD, but there were certainly benefits, and also benefits for dyslexia too. So we need to get those two things working in combination with each other. Won't say very much on quiet rooms and pods, because I think Tor's presentation covered that really, really well. But that's an example of a classroom active scenario where you've got children having to try to learn to read. And maybe we need to make sure that children with those certain needs have some sort of pod or a little bit of an escape zone within their classroom. I'll let you read this, but this is Teddy, who's one of the children who attends the school that I'm a SEND governor at, and he's wearing a bone conduction listening aid. Don't know if you've seen those before, but it's actually a headband, and it makes him look even more Jedi-like than he would in just the costume. So I'll leave that up after I've come to my last slide, which is a summary. So we know that in mainstream classrooms, you can't just design a school and put the special needs classroom in a corner and have one of them. Every mainstream classroom is going to have children with needs where we need to achieve this reasonable adjustment. The combination, the acoustic design can achieve that reasonable adjustment of 0.5 seconds and 35 dBA to get the signal to noise that we need. And then where we need to, we can use personal listening aids to achieve that boost and to reduce the reverberation time too. So the white paper does need some updating from the last study, but feel free to download and please let me know what you think. I'd really welcome your feedback. I'm going to dial back to that slide. Thank you.